This is Seth Klein, the director of CCPA, the Center for Policy Alternatives branch in BC. Today we're going to be talking about the problems with the BC financial system. Uh, more specifically, you Seth talk about fair tax reform. Uh, why is it needed? What is the problem? What are the symptoms that makes you feel that there should be a reform?
Well, there's really two problems that we're trying to address simultaneously. One is that tax revenues overall are simply too low. We saw a lot of this stems from the dramatic tax cuts that came in when Gordon Campbell was first elected. And we saw these big cuts in personal income taxes that were of no benefit or very little benefit to most people, but they cost a lot of money to the public treasury. And so all of the debates, the angst that we now have about not having, the cupboard's always bare and the budget's always squeezed and there's not enough money for health and education and welfare and housing and environment. A lot of that stems from those tax cuts at the beginning of this century. 12, 13 years ago. And so we just need to raise new revenues if we're actually going to tackle poverty and climate change. But the second problem is that our overall tax system is simply unfair. But what I mean by that is that while the personal income tax system is progressive, meaning as you make more money, you pay more in taxes, not only in dollars, but as a share of your income. But all the other taxes that we pay, so property taxes, sales taxes, MSP premiums, all the other taxes are regressive, meaning that they hit lower and modest income households harder as a share of their income. And when you roll all of those together, as we have in some of our modeling, you end up with an overall tax system in BC that's a downward sloping line. What it basically says is the more you make, the higher your income in BC, the lower your overall tax rate. And I don't think that's what most British Columbians want.
So you're saying that originally there was a good intention of the income tax being progressive, but because of changes in the last 10 years or so, we have been eroding the system so much that now the overall is rather regressive instead of progressive.
The income tax is still progressive, but the province's reliance on income tax has been shrunk by about a third. And so other taxes, MSP premiums and sales taxes and carbon taxes have all become more significant, a source of government revenue. And that's not even counting user fees or lottery incomes or things like, gaming incomes. All of these things are regressive. So the relative role of progressive income tax has shrunk. All these other taxes have become more significant. And when you roll them all together, you're left with an overall tax system that is simply unfair.
Regressive.
Yeah.
All right. Now, you said it's more fair, and obviously the question a lot of people ask, more fair for whom? Because some people, if you're making a lot of money, they say, what do you mean it's not fair that I'm paying so much tax? A lot of people don't like to pay taxes, apparently. But I hear you had a research with embryonics polling, and they found something that was kind of surprising about people having this idea that we don't want to pay taxes.
Yeah. Well, actually, just before I tell you about the Environics poll, I would say to you that I actually think most British Columbians, even higher income British Columbians, actually believe in that idea of progressivity, meaning they actually subscribe to the view that as you make more money, not only should you pay more in dollars, but you should ante in a little bit more as a share of your income. Because what those results tell us is people aren't prepared to just say yes to an increase in taxes. They want to know what it's for. They want to know that it's linked to services that are important to our quality of life. And so that all becomes part of the grand bargain.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I had in mind, was that some people may be willing to pay more for services, but they probably would be more inclined to do so if they know exactly what they are paying for, because there's a lot of mismanagement in government and misexpenditures and items that are not necessarily social services, and people think, oh, that there goes my taxes. We're paying for a stadium, for the roof in the stadium, or for a convention center, or for a highway that doesn't really is not really required. So I think that if people knew what they were paying for, they're perhaps more willing to accept it.
What you're saying now is really an important caveat in all of this. That on the one hand, we found these quite hopeful results about people's willingness to pay more for themselves and their fellow citizens for these services. But on the other hand, that was mitigated by, and this came up particularly in focus groups we did, less so on the online poll, that there is, as you're saying, this deep distrust of government. People are angered by what they see as waste in government. Unfortunately, they have a very exaggerated sense of how much waste there is. You know, sometimes in the focus groups, people had a sense that government waste constituted as much as half the budget. Well, that's simply not true. I mean, the majority of the budget is transfers to individuals and institutions like hospitals and schools. So that kind of measured people's support. But to our mind, the key lesson in all of this is that we need a big conversation about taxes. And we need to have more participatory approaches, whether it's participatory budgeting or some kind of big conversation like we had on health a few years ago, or electoral reform, where we get to deliberate together. Because as distrustful as people are of politicians, they are quite trusting of their fellow citizens. And they're willing to delegate to their fellow citizens to make some of these deliberations together, and where they get to think about trade-offs. And when there's that kind of participation, it becomes a bit of a game changer, and it changes what people are willing to say yes to.
Yeah. Have you heard anything about this participatory budgeting that apparently was, I don't know if it was last year or a year before in Calgary? And it occurs to me that groups like yours could be lobbying the government to have more participatory budgets. I mean, they have the money to make these events possible more than CCP8 would, perhaps.
Right, exactly.
And if you would advocate for participatory budgets, starting with maybe municipal participatory budgets and then provincial, the province should also have this groups of constituency assemblies where people can participate and learn more about why do we need to pay more taxes, or why do we have to pay for this or that. Would you be willing to do that?
Well, in fact, we long have. And when we were sharing the results of our tax work and tax polling with policymakers, that was in fact the key recommendation that we were making, you know, which was, don't just do what we're telling you to do on taxes. The key recommendation was host a big conversation, some big deliberative exercise about taxes, and trust people and let them deliberate. I didn't know about the Calgary example.
A problem that I find sometimes with municipal budgeting, I think I attended once to a Vancouver public input on budget, but when the city has already predetermined answers and say, do you choose blue or white? Like you have just a very narrow choice. Sometimes it doesn't match with what we're thinking, because you might have some other idea of how it should be collected or how it should be expended, but this budget is, they limit your focus. Say, we're gonna sell the house. The problem is, do we collect it cash or charges? You know, so it's not much of a
well, look, the
opinion.
process matters. The process matters. People have to trust the process. But sometimes, even when the process, well, for example, you may recall a few years ago, the province hosted this big conversation on health.
Mm-hmm.
The questions, the overarching questions, were very loaded in a similar way as you're describing. And some of the fact sheets that they provided were also somewhat biased.
Bias, yeah.
But they contracted with an outside firm to run the actual exercise. And they did a fantastic job of organizing it. And so what that set in motion is, because I actually participated in the Vancouver one.
I was there. I talked to you when you were there.
Yeah. Back a bit. But what I saw is you saw a public pushing back on the questions. And so the process worked really well.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that is that in the end, nothing happened.
Yeah. Well, so the key flaw in that one is that it had no real authority or mandate. In contrast, when the government did the Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform, it did have a mandate. It was empowered to put a question to a binding referendum. And, you know, my recollection at the time, and this goes back to 2005 when we had the first referendum, and this speaks to the point that the public may lack trust in politicians, but they trust their fellow citizens. I remember having lots of conversations with people when that referendum was on, where people said something like this, you know, this single transferable vote they're recommending seems really complicated and I can't really explain it. I don't know quite how it works, but gosh, those people worked really hard. And I'm going to honor their recommendation. And nearly 60% of the public voted yes.
Well, the problem with referendums and plebiscites, I find, is the threshold that we require to present an initiative. Here we need about 10%. If you go to Switzerland, it's 2.5%. 100,000 citizens of Switzerland can put forward an initiative. If you go to Finland, there's 1.2% of citizens, which is I don't know, something like 50,000 because it's a smaller country. Well, why do we require such a big number of people to put forward an initiative? Yeah. So we're kind of blocking democracy in a way.
Yeah, and I think our threshold's probably too high. And similarly with the referendum on electoral reform, the threshold for success was set at 60%. And so that made it hard as well.
And who should decide on that? Should a set of politicians or interest groups and lobbyists decide that? Or should it be conducted a referendum where everybody answers that question?
Well, as I was just saying, I would much prefer not a referendum, but something like the Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform. It's complicated. I work a lot in this stuff, and I find it complicated.
Is it possible to indoctrinate a group of people if they're a captive audience in a classroom for a week or 5 days, and the lobby groups that want to push for a certain idea come and convince that small group? Would it be easier for them to convince a group of 60 or 160 rather than 3 million people in BC?
Possibly. But I think, you know, any way you cut it with these complex issues, you want people who are going to really dig in and get at the stuff. And it comes back, as we were saying before, to having a process that's well designed. I thought the Citizens Assembly process had a few design flaws, but it was largely well designed.
So it is the decision making of one group of people instead of another group of people, because traditionally we leave the politicians, the 85 politicians, to make the decision. Now we're saying, well, there is 160 people that can also make the decisions. So we're transferring power from one group to another group. And what I'm saying is, we have the means to inform everybody through the internet, through the media. So why not include everybody rather than just transferring power from one group to another group?
Well, just to remind you, what the process actually was with the Citizens Assembly was both, right? Like, first, a group of citizens who had to be nonpartisan to get picked deliberated together and wrestled with this stuff and learned about stuff. They made a recommendation. That recommendation was then put to a referendum. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So both, in fact, occurred.
The recommendation becomes a partisan in the end because they have an opinion at the end. So it becomes a partisan.